She said my name like it was a warning. I didn't flinch. I kept my eyes on the paperwork, steady as if the sound hadn't reached me at all. Inside, something clicked into place. Not anger. Readiness. I had waited longer than they knew. If you've ever been dismissed, judged, or quietly pushed aside by family, this story will stay with you. Watch closely. Every moment matters. It was Tuesday late afternoon, the kind where the light turns pale and offices smell faintly of dust and coffee gone cold. The conference room clock read 4:17 p.m. I noticed because she always hated being late, and today she was exactly on time. That alone felt deliberate. Everyone remember this, she said, tapping the table once. This is what happens when you give up. A few people laughed softly. Not cruelly. Worse than that. Politely. I felt the leather chair under my palms, cool and familiar. My hands didn't shake. They hadn't shaken in years. That was new, and it mattered. I had been invited as a courtesy. That was clear from the seating, from the way my name appeared last on the printed agenda, misspelled. A small thing. Intentional. I made a note of it the way I always did now. Someone shifted beside me. Another person avoided my eyes entirely. These were old habits resurfacing, like a smell you don't notice until it's everywhere. No one expected me to speak. That was part of the arrangement. She went on, recounting my past as if it were a cautionary tale she'd memorized. She skipped details that didn't fit. She added others that had never happened. I recognized the rhythm. I had lived inside it once. I remembered a different room decades earlier, where my voice had cracked when I tried to explain myself. Today my throat stayed loose. I took a slow breath through my nose. Coffee. Lemon cleaner. Something floral from her perfume, sharp and over-applied. She leaned back, satisfied, and finally looked at me. You understand, she said. It wasn't a question. I smiled. Not wide. Not small. Practiced. It unsettled her. I saw it flicker quick as a blink. What she didn't know sat quietly in my bag, zipped and unremarkable. What she didn't know had already passed through my hands that morning. I let the weight of it settle in my mind without touching it yet. The meeting dragged. Budget lines. Staffing issues. Familiar complaints dressed up as concern. I listened more than necessary. Listening had become a skill, one that paid dividends later. At 4:43, the chair asked if anyone had final thoughts. Silence pooled in the room. I felt it press against my ribs. I do, I said. My voice sounded like my own again, older but clearer. Heads turned. Someone dropped a pen. She stiffened just slightly, the way people do when they realize they've misjudged a room. I stood. The chair scraped softly against the floor. I didn't rush. There was no need. I think it's interesting, I said, how often stories survive longer than facts. Her smile tightened. Are you correcting me? She asked, light, amused. No, I said. I'm contextualizing. The clock ticked. No one laughed this time. I met her eyes fully then, face to face at last, and let the moment stretch just long enough for her to realize something had shifted, though she couldn't yet name what it was. Someone cleared their throat near the door. The intern, young enough to be my granddaughter, glanced between us, unsure whether to interrupt. She held a folder to her chest like a shield. I caught her eye and nodded once. He relaxed. That mattered more than it should have. She's just sharing perspective, the chair said, trying to smooth it over. His tone was careful, managerial. He wanted calm, not truth. Perspective, I thought. That word had followed women like me for years, used to soften dismissal. I felt a familiar pressure behind my eyes, not tears, just memory. I pressed my tongue to the roof of my mouth until it passed. She folded her arms. We all know how this ended, she said. Some choices close doors. Some doors, I replied, aren't meant to be walked through right away. A murmur. Not agreement. Curiosity. Different and dangerous for her. The air conditioner kicked on with a low hum. Papers rustled. Outside the narrow window, the sky dimmed toward evening. Time was doing its quiet work, whether she noticed or not. I thought of the morning, of the careful sequence of events that had already unfolded elsewhere. Of signatures. Of processes that did not rely on opinion. I kept my face neutral. Years of practice had taught me that restraint unnerves people more than accusation. She stood abruptly. This isn't the place, she said, voice sharper now. We're done revisiting old mistakes. Old, she called them. as if they had aged without consequence. I stepped closer to the table, close enough that she had to tilt her head to meet my gaze. I lowered my voice not for secrecy but for control. "No," I said. "We're just beginning to look at them." The room went still. Even the clock seemed louder. She searched my face, finally sensing the outline of what she'd missed. Her certainty faltered. "What are you talking about?" she asked. I reached for my bag. Not to reveal anything but to give myself a moment to breathe, and the room seemed to exhale with me. I didn't open it. I simply felt its weight, familiar, earned, steady, and then let my hand fall back to my side as if nothing inside mattered yet. They mistook that pause for hesitation. People often do. Over the years, I learned that silence makes others fill it with their own assumptions, and assumptions are useful if you know how to listen. She watched me closely, searching for the old version of me, the one who rushed to explain. She didn't find her. I sat back down instead of standing my ground. It confused her. It always did. The chair felt solid beneath me, grounding. I folded my hands and waited for the meeting to move on, letting the moment pass without resolution. That restraint had taken decades to learn. When the meeting finally adjourned, people avoided me in careful arcs. A few offered polite smiles. One woman brushed my arm and whispered, "I'm glad you spoke up." It wasn't courage I felt then. It was confirmation. I gathered my papers slowly and left the room last, the way you do when you're no longer afraid of what people say behind your back. The hallway smelled faintly of copier toner and old carpet. I walked past framed photographs of past leadership, mostly men, their smiles stiff with certainty. I remembered when disappearing felt like failure. Back then I thought absence meant defeat. I was wrong. I didn't vanish. I recalibrated. There were years when my name wasn't spoken at tables like that. I worked jobs that didn't impress anyone. I learned to listen more than I talked. I learned who controlled outcomes and who only thought they did. Power, I discovered, rarely announces itself. It hums quietly behind procedures, policies, and patience. I learned it the hard way. In offices with flickering lights. In classrooms where I was older than the instructor. In meetings where my suggestions were ignored until repeated by someone else. Each slight taught me something useful, though I didn't see it at the time. Outside the building, the late-day air was cool against my face. I paused on the steps, letting the noise of traffic ground me. A security guard nodded as I passed. He always did. We had exchanged names months ago. Small respect matters. It accumulates. My phone buzzed. A short message. "Call me when you're free." No name attached. I didn't need one. Some relationships don't require explanation. I slipped the phone back into my coat pocket and headed toward the parking lot. I remembered the first time I realized power wasn't about recognition. It was about leverage. About understanding systems well enough to move within them without being seen. I had spent years studying how decisions were made, not just who made them. That knowledge had cost me sleep, comfort, and pride. It had also given me something steadier. In the car, I sat for a moment before turning the key. My hands rested easily on the wheel. They used to tremble after confrontations. Now they didn't. That change hadn't come from confidence. It came from preparation. They believed I had settled. That I had accepted the version of the story they preferred. Let them. Underestimation creates space. Space is where plans breathe. As I drove away, the building shrank in my rearview mirror. I felt no urge to look back. What mattered wasn't behind me or even beside me. It was unfolding quietly, step by step, in places they hadn't thought to watch yet. I stopped at a small grocery on the way home, the kind with uneven carts and handwritten signs. Inside, I ran into an old colleague who barely recognized me. We exchanged pleasantries. She spoke about promotions and titles. I listened and asked questions. She never asked what I was doing now. That told me everything. At the checkout, the clerk struggled with the register. I waited without impatience. People reveal themselves under pressure. I thanked her by name when I left. Outside, the sky had softened into evening. I felt tired but not worn down. There's a difference you learn with age. Driving the rest of the way, I considered how disappearance had been a gift disguised as loss. It gave me time to study, to fail quietly, to succeed without witnesses. Most of all, it taught me restraint. I no longer needed to be seen to be effective. That lesson was about to matter more than anyone in that room understood yet. I turned onto my street, lights flickering on, already aware that tomorrow would demand calm, precision, and memory, the tools I had spent a lifetime learning to carry forward. I carried those tools with me into the next morning, still warm in my hands when I unlocked my office and set my bag down beside the desk. The room smelled faintly of paper and lemon oil, the way it always did after the custodial crew passed through. I liked arriving early. It gave me time to settle before the day began asking things of me. I hung my coat, poured myself a cup of tea, and turned on the small lamp instead of the overhead light. Outside, the sky was pale and undecided. Inside, my desk waited exactly as I'd left it. Neat. Predictable. That mattered more to me than it used to. I logged in, scanned my schedule, answered 2 short emails. Routine steadies the mind. Then I opened the review queue. Names, numbers, documents. Lives condensed into files. I had learned to respect that weight without letting it crush me. Halfway down the list, something tugged at my attention. Not the name at first. The phrasing in the summary line. Familiar. Too familiar. My shoulders tightened before I knew why. I opened the application. The essay loaded slowly, line by line, and with each sentence a strange quiet filled the room. It wasn't anger I felt. It was recognition. The kind that settles deep in the chest, heavy and exact. The story wasn't about me. Not directly. That was the clever part. It was about a family overcoming embarrassment. About resilience framed as correction. About a woman who made poor choices so others could learn what not to do. The language was polished. Confident. Detached. I set my cup down carefully. My hands were steady, but my pulse had quickened. I had read thousands of essays over the years. Very few reached backward like this, into places I hadn't expected to visit again. A knock sounded at my door. Soft. "Do you have a minute?" a colleague asked, peering in. "Of course," I said, closing the file without saving my place. She stepped in, speaking about timelines and staffing. I listened, responded, asked a question or two. My voice sounded normal. Hers did not. She kept glancing at the desk, at my face, as if she sensed something she couldn't quite see. When she left, the room felt different. Smaller. I reopened the application. This time I read more slowly. The writer was young. Earnest. The essay wasn't cruel in tone. That was what made it unsettling. Cruelty delivered calmly often does the most damage. I noticed the assumptions tucked between sentences. The confidence of someone who had never been corrected. Who believed their interpretation was objective truth. I wondered where that certainty had come from. I scrolled to the recommendation letters. Strong. Expected. Nothing out of place. On paper, the candidate was impressive. That complicated things in ways I didn't enjoy. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a moment. The chair creaked softly. I pressed my feet flat against the floor, grounding myself. This wasn't personal, I reminded myself. It was procedural. And yet, my body remembered before my mind could finish the thought. There were rules for situations like this. Guidelines. Ethics. I reviewed them in my head one by one. They existed for good reason. Fairness isn't instinctive. It has to be maintained deliberately. Another email came in. Then another. The day moved forward whether I was ready or not. I flagged the application for further review and stood to stretch. My knees protested. I smiled at that. Time leaves its marks everywhere. At lunch, I ate alone as usual, flipping through notes I'd made on other files. So my thoughts circle back. Not to the writer but to the pattern. How stories get handed down. How judgments harden into lessons without anyone questioning their source. In the afternoon, I called a brief meeting with 2 reviewers. We discussed unrelated cases. I watched how they spoke, what they valued, where they hesitated. Information gathers quietly if you let it. Back in my office, as the light shifted and shadows stretched across the floor, I returned to the essay one last time. I read it as if I were a stranger. As if none of it touched me. It was a useful exercise. It told me what the text did on its own without my history attached. I saved my notes, careful and sparse. No conclusions yet. Just observations. Before shutting down for the evening, I glanced once more at the name on the file. It sat there, unchanged, unaware. I closed the screen gently as if it might bruise. Some questions I knew don't ask permission before they return. They simply wait until you're strong enough to meet them, seated at a desk you earned, holding decisions that must be handled with care. Some questions I knew don't ask permission before they return, so I met this one the only way I knew how, by following the rules exactly as written. The next morning I reopened the file with fresh eyes and a steadier breath. I printed the essay not because I needed paper but because distance matters. Ink slows you down. It forces you to look at words instead of reacting to them. I read every line again, marking nothing, letting the language stand on its own. I reminded myself why the system exists. Not to protect feelings. Not to reward intentions. It exists to evaluate what is presented, nothing more. That clarity felt grounding. I had earned it through years of being told I was too emotional to be trusted with decisions. At mid-morning, an email arrived from compliance. Routine review, they said. Random. I almost smiled. The timing felt deliberate, though I knew better than to believe in signs. Still, I welcomed the scrutiny. Transparency has a way of steadying shaky rooms. I scheduled a secondary read, assigning the file to 2 colleagues who did not know my history and did not need to. One was meticulous to a fault. The other favored clarity over charm. Together they balanced each other well. I sent no commentary. Just the file. While I waited, I worked through the rest of the queue. Life has a way of insisting on its normal rhythm even when something personal presses close. I returned calls. Reviewed transcripts. Made notes that would never be seen by the people they affected. Around noon I walked down the hall to refill my tea. The hum of voices drifted from an open office. Someone was laughing. Someone else sounded tired. The world continued. That mattered. It reminded me that no single story, even mine, sits at the center of everything. Back at my desk, I noticed a small detail I'd missed before. A phrase repeated twice in the essay, nearly identical. It suggested certainty where curiosity might have served better. I wrote a brief note to myself. No judgment. Just observation. By mid-afternoon the first review came back. Thoughtful. Measured. Strong structure, it read. But assumptions feel unexamined. I exhaled slowly. Not relief. Confirmation. The system was doing what it was meant to do. The second review arrived an hour later. Compelling voice, it said. However, argument relies heavily on framing another's experience without sufficient context. I set both notes side by side. Neither mentioned me. Neither needed to. So my chest felt tight. Not with anger but with memory. I took a moment to stand, pressing my palms against the desk until the feeling passed. This work requires presence but not indulgence. I had learned that the hard way. Later a colleague stopped by my door. Busy day? She asked gently. Productive, I said. It was the truth. She lingered, glancing at the stack of papers. Sometimes I wonder how you stay so even, she said, with cases that hit close to home. I considered her words carefully. Practice, I replied. And trust. She nodded, satisfied enough, and left me alone again. As evening approached, I drafted my formal assessment. Clear. Concise. Supported by policy. I avoided adjectives that leaned toward emotion. I cited criteria. I referenced patterns, not people. Each sentence felt like placing a stone in a wall meant to last. When I finished, I reread it twice. Not for tone. For fairness. That mattered more. Before submitting, I paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. This was the moment people imagine as revenge. The choice. The power. But that wasn't what it felt like. It felt like responsibility. Heavy. Quiet. Earned. I submitted the review and logged the time. Procedure completed. On my way out, I passed the same framed photographs lining the hall. I noticed something new this time. In the corner of one frame, a small plaque listed names I'd never seen referenced elsewhere. People who had done the work without becoming the story. Outside, dusk had settled in. The air was cooler. I wrapped my coat tighter and walked to my car, feeling the day in my bones. Not exhaustion. Wait. Driving home, I thought about how easily punishment can be mistaken for justice. How tempting it is to act when emotion sharpens your hand. I had done neither. I had trusted the process I helped uphold. That choice didn't bring peace. Not yet. But it brought something steadier. As I parked and turned off the engine, my phone buzzed with a notification confirming receipt of my assessment. No details. No outcome. Just acknowledgement. I sat there a moment longer, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine, knowing the system was now moving forward without me, exactly as it was designed to do. 2 weeks later, the call came while I was folding laundry. Ordinary socks. Warm cotton. Life happening at a scale that no longer felt fragile. I let the phone ring once before answering, already aware of what it would be about, though not how it would land. It's been finalized, the voice said. Professional. Neutral. The committee reached a decision. I thanked them and ended the call before details could spill out in a way that felt unnecessary. I didn't need the language. I already knew the shape of it. The system had spoken in its own careful way. That evening, an email arrived from a familiar address. Not the applicant. Someone older. The subject line was polite, almost casual, as if nothing unusual had happened. I opened it slowly. They wanted to talk. They wanted clarity. They wanted, I realized, reassurance that the story they'd told for years still held. I agreed to meet. We sat across from each other days later in a quiet cafe, the kind with chipped mugs and a radio humming softly behind the counter. She looked smaller than I remembered. Older. Time had been working on her too, just differently. I didn't expect this, she said finally. She was so sure. So was I replied. She frowned, confused. You always were. The words hung between us. Not an apology. Not an accusation. Just a habit resurfacing. I felt something loosen in my chest. Not pain. Recognition. She worked hard, she said. You know that. I do, I said. And so did I. Her mouth opened then closed. She studied me more closely now, as if seeing me for the first time without the story she'd relied on. That story had needed me small. Wrong. Finished. What happened? She asked. I took a sip of my coffee. Bitter. Familiar. The essay spoke for itself. She bristled. You're saying... I'm saying nothing, I interrupted gently. The process did. Silence settled. The radio clicked between songs. A spoon clinked against a saucer somewhere behind us. She learned that from you, she said at last. That way of telling it. I know, I said. That was the truth. And it was enough. She looked down at her hands. They trembled slightly. I remembered when mine had. How often I'd hidden them. I felt no urge to reach across the table. This wasn't a moment for comfort. It was a moment for honesty. You survived, she said, quieter now. I thought you just faded out. I shook my head. I grew out. The words surprised us both. They felt right as soon as they were spoken. When we stood to leave, she hesitated. You didn't have to meet me. I wanted to, I said. And I meant it. Closure isn't about kindness. It's about completion. We parted without an embrace. That felt honest too. Later that night, alone in my living room, I turned off the lights and sat by the window. The street lamps cast soft circles on the pavement. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere else someone laughed. The world kept moving, unconcerned with old narratives finally losing their grip. I thought about the girl I'd been. The woman they needed me to stay. How carefully they'd shaped that version to fit their fears. I had outlived her. Quietly. Thoroughly. The next morning I returned to work. Another stack of files waited. More lives. More decisions. I approached them with the same care. The same restraint. Nothing about me had hardened. It had clarified. Weeks later, a handwritten note arrived at my office. From the applicant. Brief. Polite. Grateful for the opportunity. No bitterness. No blame. I read it twice and placed it in my drawer. Not as a trophy. As a reminder. Some lessons land late. That doesn't make them useless. On my drive home that evening, the sun dipped low, lighting the road ahead in gold. I felt my age then not as a weight but as an accumulation. Of knowledge. Of patience. Of survival done without applause. I no longer needed them to understand me. I no longer needed my name spoken as a warning or a lesson. I had become something they couldn't revise or reuse. I turned onto my street, parked, and sat for a moment before going inside. The house was quiet. Safe. I outlived the version of me they needed to control, and in doing so, I finally became the woman I was always meant to keep. If this story spoke to something you've lived through, you're not alone. Subscribe for more stories about strength, betrayal, and the quiet power of survival.